You brought home a good piece of beef. You chose it carefully at the market. Thick, deep red, the kind of cut that looks like it will make a real meal. You seasoned it the way you usually do, put it in the pan, and cooked it the way you always have. And when you sliced it at the table, it was tough. Not inedible. Just not what it should have been. The kind of chew that makes you work for every bite. The kind of texture that tells you something went wrong somewhere, but you cannot say exactly where. You blamed the cut, maybe, or the heat, or the timing. You told yourself next time you would buy better beef. But here is the thing. It probably was not the cut. It was most likely something that happened before the beef ever touched the pan. Something in the preparation, in the handling, in the steps that most modern kitchens have stopped doing because they seem unnecessary. Steps that old farm kitchens knew without question and never skipped. I have watched beef go from tough to tender, not because of expensive tools or complicated techniques, but because of a few practices that do not cost anything. Some of these come from the way meat was handled in households where waste was not an option. Families who raised animals, butchered them, and cooked them that same week. They learned something important. The muscle remembers stress. And your job, before you ever light the stove, is to help it forget. My name is Samuel Miller. I have lived most of my life in a plain household in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. We did not grow up with a lot of fancy equipment in the kitchen. What we had was time, attention, and the habits passed down through our family. Habits that made simple cuts of beef taste like something worth sitting down for. I want to share some of those habits with you today. By the end of this video, you will understand why your beef is tough before you even start cooking, how to choose the right cut for the result you want, how to handle the meat before it ever hits heat, which simple techniques break down the fibers that make beef chewy, how to apply salt so it actually helps instead of dries, how to rest beef so the juice stays in the meat instead of on the cutting board, and what signs to watch for that tell you the beef is ready. Not the clock, not a guess, but the beef itself telling you. This is not about secret ingredients. It is about understanding what beef is, what makes it tough, and what makes it relax. Once you understand those things, the tenderness follows naturally. Let me start before the stove, before seasoning, before the pan gets warm. Beef is muscle. Every piece you buy was a working muscle in a living animal. Some muscles worked harder than others. The shoulder carried weight. The leg moved constantly. The muscles along the back, the loin, the rib, moved very little. This difference matters more than any marinade you will ever make. Hard-working muscles are tough. They contain more connective tissue, more dense fiber. That does not make them bad. It makes them flavorful. But it means they need different treatment than a muscle that barely moved. You cannot cook a shoulder the same way you cook a tenderloin and expect the same result. Old farm kitchens understood this because the people in them had watched the animal in the field. They knew where the effort had come from. When you walk into a store today, most people look at price and color. They do not think about which part of the body they are buying, or what that part was doing for most of its life, or what kind of cooking that muscle actually needs. That single gap in understanding causes more tough meals than almost anything else. If you want beef that can be cooked in minutes and still be soft, you need a cut from a low-work muscle. The tenderloin, the strip, the ribeye. These come from the back, from areas that did not labor. They are naturally tender and need only heat and rest to give you everything they have. If you want to cook a tougher cut, the chuck, the brisket, the round, the shank, you need time. Slow heat. Long cooking. The kind of environment that melts collagen down into gelatin and turns what was chewy into something that pulls apart with a fork. You cannot rush this with high heat and short time. The muscle will seize, the moisture will escape, and you will end up with something that has lost both tenderness and juice. So before you do anything else, know what you have. Look at the label. Ask the butcher. Feel the cut in your hand. A high work muscle has visible grain, long, tight fibers running in one clear direction. A low work muscle is finer, more compact, almost silky when you press it gently. These are the first things to read. Before salt, before fire, before anything. The next thing that matters happens before the pan gets warm, and most people skip it entirely. Cold beef doesn't cook evenly. When you take a piece of meat straight from the refrigerator and put it into a hot pan, the outside changes fast while the inside is still cold. The surface can overcook before the center reaches the right temperature. What comes out is beef that is overdone on the outside and underdone in the middle. Or, if you cook it long enough for the center, dry and tough on the outer layers. The old practice was simple. Bring the beef to room temperature before it meets heat. Take it out of the cold and let it sit. 30 minutes for thinner cuts, up to an hour for something thick. A kitchen that understood this did not rush this step. The meat came out when the cook started preparing everything else: the onions, the fire, the rest of the meal. By the time everything was ready, the beef had relaxed. It went into heat that was even, and it cooked more evenly because of it. Now we get to something that is perhaps the most misunderstood step in making beef tender, and one that every old kitchen I ever knew practiced without question. Salt. But not salt right before cooking. Not a quick shake and into the pan. Salt early. Salt well. Salt and wait. Here is what happens when you apply salt to raw beef and let it sit. The salt draws out a small amount of moisture from the surface. That moisture, over time, dissolves the salt. Then, through osmosis, that salty liquid is drawn back into the meat. What returns is not plain water. It is brine that has penetrated below the surface and into the fiber itself. Beef seasoned this way is not just salted on the outside. It is seasoned through. But there is another effect that matters even more for tenderness. Salt breaks down proteins. It disrupts the tight structure of the muscle fibers, softening them before heat ever touches the meat. A piece of beef that has been salted and rested for 30 to 60 minutes before cooking is already beginning to become more tender. You are starting the process before the fire does. The old way in many farm households was to salt the meat in the morning if it was to be cooked at midday, or the night before if the cut was thick. The salt had time to work. The result was beef with flavor all the way through, not just on the surface, and a tenderness that people assumed came from the cut when it actually came from the patience of the cook. There is a mistake worth naming here. If you salt beef and cook it immediately, within the first 5 minutes, the surface moisture has been drawn out but not yet reabsorbed. That wet surface will steam in the pan instead of sear. You lose the crust, which means you lose flavor and texture both. Either salt early and wait a good long while, or salt right at the moment the beef hits the fire. The in-between time is where most people unknowingly go wrong. Use coarse salt, kosher or sea salt, rather than fine iodized table salt. You can see it, distribute it evenly, and judge how much you are using. A generous pinch on each side, rubbed in gently with your fingers. Then leave it alone. There is another method that older households used for tougher cuts, and it is so simple that when I describe it, people sometimes assume it cannot matter much. A small amount of acid, not a heavy marinade, not an entire bottle of something poured over the meat. A small amount, a few tablespoons of something acidic applied to the surface and given time to work. In simple farm kitchens, this might have been a splash of vinegar, a squeeze of lemon, or a bit of buttermilk rubbed onto the meat before the rest of the seasoning. The acid attacks the surface proteins the same way salt does, but through a different path. It begins to unwind the tight protein structures on the outside of the meat. What was coiled and rigid starts to soften. When heat arrives, it finds fibers that have already started to relax. This is the same principle behind buttermilk-soaked chicken, behind the way some families marinate lamb in yogurt before grilling. The acid is not primarily for flavor, though it adds some. It is doing structural work. For beef, this works particularly well on thinner cuts, steaks and chops, where the acid can reach the relevant layers in a reasonable time. Even 30 minutes with a light acid treatment before cooking can make a noticeable difference in how easily the fibers separate when you chew. You do not want to overdo it. Leaving beef in a strongly acidic marinade for many hours can make the surface mushy and gray, breaking things down too far. 30 minutes to 2 hours is usually enough. A simple approach: rub the cut with coarse salt, brush the surface with a little apple cider vinegar, cover it loosely, and let it sit for an hour before cooking. When you dry the surface before the pan, the texture is already different under your fingers. Slightly softer, more yielding. That is the work being done. Let us talk about the cut itself, because how you slice beef after cooking is just as important as what you do before. Beef has grain. You can see it if you look. Long fibers running in one direction, like the grain of wood. When you cut with the grain, you are cutting along those fibers. And when you chew, your teeth have to break through their full length. The beef feels tough even when it was cooked correctly. When you cut against the grain, across those fibers, you are shortening them before they reach the mouth. Each bite contains short sections of fiber instead of long ones. The same piece of beef, cut differently, chews like a completely different meal. This single change can make a well-cooked flank steak or skirt steak feel tender where it otherwise would have been chewy. It costs nothing and requires no extra time. The challenge is that in some cuts, the grain changes direction as you move through the meat. Watch as you cut. Adjust the angle of your knife as needed. Keep looking at the surface of the meat as you slice, not straight ahead at the wall. The knife should be sharp. A dull knife tears instead of cuts. When you tear fibers you were trying to shorten, you damage the texture, and those edges release moisture faster when chewed. A clean cut across the grain gives you slices that hold together and hold their juice. My grandfather kept one knife for meat and sharpened it every time before use. He did not use it for anything else. At the time, as a child, that seemed like a strange habit. Later, it made complete sense. There is something else that happens when you pay attention to the grain. You begin to see the beef differently, not just as a piece of food, but as a structure. You notice that some cuts have grain running in two directions, especially larger roasts. The brisket is a good example. The flat and the point have fibers that angle differently from each other. And if you slice the whole thing in one direction, you will get tender bites from one section and tough ones from the other. The solution is simple. Separate the two parts before slicing, then cut each one against its own grain. A small adjustment that makes the whole thing more consistent. Skirt steak is another cut where the grain is dramatic and obvious, long, wide fibers running clearly across the width of the cut. Slice it with the grain, and it is like chewing rope. Slice it against the grain, across the width, and what felt like a rough cut becomes something almost silky. The transformation happens in 30 seconds with a sharp knife. It is one of the clearest demonstrations I know of how much the cutting direction matters. Not the cooking, not the seasoning, just the direction of the blade at the end. We have covered choosing the right cut, bringing it to temperature, salting it early, using a small amount of acid, and cutting against the grain. Let me pause here, because some of you may be thinking, I do these things, or most of them, and my beef is still tough. If that is you, the answer is most likely in what happens after the heat. Resting the beef after cooking is not optional. It is the last and in some ways most important part of making beef tender and juicy. When beef goes into heat, its muscle fibers contract. As they contract, they push moisture toward the center of the meat. If you cut immediately after pulling it off the heat, that moisture is under pressure and has nowhere to go but out, onto your cutting board, pooling around the slices, leaving the meat drier than it should be. If you let the beef rest, off the heat, loosely covered, undisturbed, those fibers gradually relax. The pressure releases. The moisture redistributes through the meat instead of being driven to the center. When you cut it after resting, the juice stays in each slice. How long depends on the size of the piece. A thin steak, 5 to 7 minutes. A thick steak, 10 to 15. A large roast, up to 30 minutes. The resting time should be proportional to the cooking time. Cover it loosely with foil or a clean cloth, not sealed tight. You are not trying to keep it cooking, just slowing the cooling while the fibers settle. In an old kitchen, the meat rested because the cook was busy with everything else. The bread was coming out of the oven. The children were being called to wash. The timing worked in the meat's favor. In a modern kitchen, where people are impatient to serve, the resting step gets skipped, and the cutting board ends up red with juice that should have stayed in the meal. I want to be specific about something here, because I think it gets misunderstood. Resting does not mean the beef goes cold. A thick steak retains heat at its center for quite a while after it leaves the pan. The outside cools first, but the center stays warm during those 10 or 15 minutes of rest. What you are waiting for is not the temperature to drop. You are waiting for the pressure inside the meat to equalize. The fibers that clenched under heat need time to open back up and hold what they have. That process cannot be rushed by covering tighter or leaving the beef near the stove. It simply takes the time it takes. If the beef has gone too cool by the time you cut it, a warm pan, not hot, just warm, held over low heat for 30 seconds can bring the surface back without driving out moisture. But in most home kitchens, even a 15-minute rest still leaves the beef plenty warm enough to eat with satisfaction. The goal was never to serve it scalding hot. The goal was to serve it at its best. One more method I want to explain, and this one is for tougher cuts when you have more time. Slow, low heat with liquid. Braising, old-fashioned stewing, pot roasting, different names for the same idea. You take a cut with a lot of connective tissue, a chuck, a shank, a short rib, and cook it slowly in a covered pot with enough liquid to keep the environment moist and the temperature steady at a low level. What happens over time? The collagen inside the meat, the tough, rubbery connective tissue, begins to dissolve. Collagen melts into gelatin around 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, but it needs time at that temperature to complete the change. 1 hour does less than 3. 3 does less than 6 for a truly tough cut. The longer the collagen has to dissolve, the more gelatin releases into the surrounding liquid and into the meat itself. Gelatin is silky. It coats the fibers. It gives the beef a quality people describe as melting or falling apart. The liquid you use matters, but it does not need to be fancy. Water is fine. A small amount of good stock is better. Some old kitchens added a splash of vinegar or a piece of tomato. Again, acid, working slowly on the proteins while heat works on the collagen. By the end of a long braise, a chuck roast that would have been impossible to chew raw becomes something you can cut with the side of a fork. This was the kind of meal that filled large households in cold months. A simple cut, an inexpensive piece of beef, turned by time and modest heat into something that tasted rich. The trick was not a recipe. The trick was patience. There is a version of this that some old kitchens did with even less equipment than a proper pot. A tight-wrapped bundle of seasoned beef, placed in a low oven or near steady heat for a long time, can achieve something close to the same result. The key is always the same: low temperature, sustained over time, with moisture present. Whether that moisture comes from a covered pot of liquid or from the meat's own sealed juices matters less than keeping it from evaporating entirely. What you want is an environment where the collagen has nowhere to rush and nothing forcing it to move fast. Given that environment, it dissolves at its own pace. And when it does, what was tough becomes the kind of meal that people remember. One thing worth saying about braising: the liquid left in the pot at the end is not waste. It is full of dissolved collagen, rendered fat, and the concentrated flavors of everything that cooked together. Strain it, skim it, and you have a sauce that requires nothing else. Old kitchens never discarded that liquid. It became the gravy, the base for the next day's soup, the thing you soaked the bread in. Nothing was thrown away that still had use in it. So far, we have gone through 7 things: choosing the right cut for your method, bringing the beef to temperature before cooking, salting early and giving it time, applying a light acid for tougher pieces, cutting against the grain after cooking, resting the meat after heat, and using slow, low heat with moisture for the hardest cuts. Those 7 steps together cover most of what separates a tough meal from a tender one. Before we finish, there is one more thing: the pan. It must be properly hot before the beef goes in. A pan that is not hot enough will not sear. The beef will steam in its own moisture instead of forming a crust. That crust, dark, caramelized, slightly firm at the edges, is not just about appearance. It creates flavor through a process where the surface proteins and sugars transform under high heat into complex compounds that taste rich and savory. A gray, steamed exterior misses all of that. To tell if the pan is ready, add a small amount of fat. When it shimmers, and a drop of water flicked from your fingers immediately pops and evaporates, the pan is ready. Not when the fat just barely moves, when it is alive with heat. Place the beef in and leave it. Do not press it down. Do not lift the edge to check every 30 seconds. After 2 to 3 minutes for a standard steak, lift one edge with tongs. If it releases cleanly and shows a deep brown crust, it is ready to turn. If it sticks and resists, it is not done. A properly seared piece of beef tells you when it is ready to let go. Fighting the pan means the crust is not finished. Turn it once. Sear the second side. Then rest. If there is one thing that ties all of these practices together, it is this: beef rewards care, not complexity, not an expensive pantry, not specialty tools. Care, attention, the willingness to think about what the meat needs, plan ahead, and do simple things correctly without rushing the steps that cannot be rushed. A family on a working farm understood this not because they had read about it, but because wasting a piece of beef was a real loss. The animal had been raised, the butchering had been done. What sat on the counter was the product of months of work, and it deserved to be cooked well. That feeling of not treating food as something disposable, something thrown into a pan at 7 in the evening because dinner has to happen in 15 minutes. That is something worth recovering. Most of the time when beef disappoints, the beef itself was fine. The handling was not. There is a version of cooking that treats every step as something to get through on the way to eating. And there is a version that treats each step as something that matters: the salting, the resting, the direction of the blade. The second version takes almost no more time than the first. The difference at the table, though, is considerable. The old kitchen was not smarter because it had more tools. It was smarter because it paid attention. Tell me in the comments, which of these steps was new to you? Was it the early salting? The grain direction? The resting time? I would genuinely like to know, because every kitchen is different, and every cook comes to this from a different starting point. And if you have a method that was passed down to you, something a mother, a grandmother, or a neighbor showed you about making beef tender, write it down below. Those habits live in family memory, and when nobody says them out loud, they disappear quietly. I would rather they did not. Next time, I want to talk about 3 cuts that most people overlook at the butcher counter: the flat iron, the eye of round, and the skirt steak. Cuts that cost far less than a ribeye, but, handled with care, can be just as satisfying at the table. We will go through exactly what each one needs, and why the inexpensive cut, treated with respect, can sometimes be the better meal. Until then, take your time with the meat. It will thank you for it.